This is GSA Intimate Rooms, a series of cross-unit engagements which host discussion and views of student work and themes of interest across the various units as part of the GSA Summer Show 2020. For a view into some of our programming and an online publication of all student work from this class, please visit www.gsaujsummershow2020.com or gsa.ac.za. Hi to everyone that's joined. Feel free to put on your camera just for an initial greeting to everyone. So this session will be recorded. Hi, Dr. Mark Raymond, our incoming head of school. The session will be recorded and shared on our various platforms and on our Summer Show website. Just to kick off the event, I'd just like to introduce the two guest units that are participating in this Intimate Rooms discussion, part 2. So we have Unit 17, which is head by Greg Katz, who joins us from his office, and his tutor, Nico van Lachenberg. And we've also joined by Tabogo and Nabujele from Unit 17, who are two star students from the unit. From the Unit 18 side, we're joined by myself, Sarah, and Nadira Patel. And our students who will be in conversation is Notando, Siwe, and Gloria, who I think will be joining just a little bit later. So hello to everyone. We'll be running this quite organically. We do have some discussion points which we've mentioned we think might be great points for us to begin with. But yeah, we'll shift the conversation wherever it needs to go or wants to go. I think because both units seem to like working between both digital and analog, and working with material in, I guess, very different ways, but we do have that as an underscoring element. I think we'll probably begin with a conversation around that. I think that the first point we wanted to kind of prompt through holding these two units together is discussion around the embodied material or tectonic tactics, which either or both units might use, and how thinking through how that might be worked at a scalable model might manipulate interesting thinking of something which if built would occur at a much larger scale and have perhaps different effects or similar resonances to what the original model would be. So yeah, I think maybe to start the conversation, we can open this up to Unit 17. Perhaps talking to how the idea for the units, this year's unit scale shift, this unit's framing was scale shift this year, and what the thinking was behind that, and how that's worked out, what the unit found in working at both the tiny scale and at the scale of the model to something that's applied at a much larger scale, and talking through that maybe at the idea of strategy, and then also perhaps the two students can speak to how that then manifested in their work. Okay, maybe over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I think it's wonderful to engage with other units. I think we need to do it more. It's something that I think the idea of cross-pollination of ideas is something that's very underexploited at the GSA, and I think that this year has maybe put us on the back foot in more ways than one, but particularly in terms of these sorts of opportunities to connect and exchange ideas, and certainly the students not having the opportunity to even like work in the same space has really been a disadvantage this year. It's something that's been very difficult to replicate in the digital realm, and I guess that sort of ties in quite nicely with the theme of what we're talking about here. Yeah, I love this idea of the embodied, of the kind of knowledge that is transmitted, the kind of thinking that is transmitted when one is engaged sort of physically with something. I think that we are these beings that exist in this real space around us, and yet technology is kind of makes it difficult and makes it difficult for us or takes us out of that awareness, takes us out of the awareness of our own bodies. And particularly as designers, I think that there's tremendous value in engaging with and thinking through the process of the physical, of making things in the physical world. I don't know, I'm kind of like spewing out some like garbled thinking here, but really like what I'm trying to get across is that our Unit 17's methodology, often we start with this idea of making things, of engaging with materials, and that leads to a specific kind of thinking. The thinking that is kind of like a circular thinking. It's a thinking that that allows a designer to access knowledge that is tangible, that is embodied in a process or in the physical world, and we find it very useful running through a series of experiments up front that sort of allow students to engage with materials and methods of making, and obtain knowledge through that process. Then the idea is that they are then able to translate that knowledge, take that knowledge and translate it into design thinking about design and how we make things allows us to think very deeply about the manifestation of ideas. So I don't know, I think I'd like to maybe just engage some of our students now and allow them to explain their process this year, what they experienced, and tell us a bit about how their engagement with materials and making informed their projects. Maybe we could start with Tebogo.
My project dealt with, well, it started with the idea, initially, even before GSA, I had an idea of fire. And this came from when there was a big fire in Johannesburg, where some firefighters passed away. And this is the Lisbon Bank building. So with regards to that, I looked at that concept of fire and how it is not really well, considered in our context, in South African context, and more so in the townships. My project dealt with townships fires. So I was looking at a possible way of mitigating fires in the township, and my main focus was Diepsloot. So in Diepsloot, informal settlement, and everything is very organic. So due to COVID, I was a bit delayed with my experiment, but I was able to engage with the context itself and understand how people engage with backlog of service delivery and fires that occur there and how they fight fires, and the building codes, and our standard ways of dealing with fires are different from there because they don't have land tenure, they don't own the land, and they actually live there for work purposes. So there's this transition between where's home and where is a place of living. So there's this temporary space which is considered there. So the material that is there is very combustible. They use zinc, timber, and whatnot, and the spaces between the dwellings are very close to each other. So by understanding the material as well as the knowledge of the people themselves and how they deal with fires, if there's a fire next door, what actually happened, there's actually an insurance companies that have engaged with them to actually have shack insurance, which covers a decent amount of cover for them. The materiality which they use, I was looking at ways that how can I implement walls, perhaps, like considering how government can engage with them and perhaps have a way to incrementally improve the lives of the people in that settlement by incrementally engaging with services such as walls for services, walls to allow them to densify. By including all of these sort of components, my vision will be that it will eventually get to a place where it is more like an organic sort of formal settlement. So that's more or less what I was engaging with regarding materiality and body knowledge.
Okay, maybe just to interject there. So perhaps you could also talk us through your process in terms of working with material models or kind of small-scale iterations of the wall that you were speaking of, and how that, working at such a small scale could become kind of scalable to the scale of policy or even like an urban framework that works around these kind of wall systems that we then saw in your final model. So maybe just talking to how you explored the concept at a range of different scales, and what actually working with real materials may have done for your project.
Oh, working with real scale. I didn't build a 1:1 scale model. I built tiny scale models built out of cardboard to imitate zinc, as well as paper to imitate timber. And there was that idea that, I have to associate a sort of material to what is there in life. Generally, normally we'll build cardboard for everything, but there with the materiality played a large role, because I need to understand how the fire flows in the settlement and which direction it does, considering the wind directions. So those are my scale models which I used for my project, just to understand how fire flows in a settlement. A large amount of my research was done by the I got from the University of Stellenbosch. They did do 1:1 scale models of shack fires, and so that was very helpful for me to be able to get that knowledge and understand how fire flows in the settlement. So yeah, that's how I engaged with it regarding materiality.
So I think that what's interesting about Tebogo's project is that he started off with thinking about fire and as this like real social problem that we have, like a massive problem that we have locally, and trying to really think through material solutions for this problem. So some of his earlier research, he was looking at using ash to coat the corrugated sheeting as a fire prevention method. And so those experiments, those early experiments, are kind of a 1:1 scale analysis of solutions. But then there was also this kind of micro scale investigation where he was building models of a settlement out of cardboard and watching the fire spread and trying to mimic and create the unique sets of conditions of airflow in a scale model. There's this very sort of kind of rich research that comes out of making a physical model of a large scale thing, a small scale model of a large scale thing. And I think that if you were to try and replicate that using computer technology, there's so many sort of physical variables that would come into play. That I think that you would really struggle. The modeling, the computer modeling of that would be so complex, and yet in a physical model you are able to replicate conditions in kind of a unique analog way that yields a lot of information that Tebogo was able to analyze. So he was working both at the scale of material intervention at 1:1, like how do you transform materials so that they will be more fireproof, materials that are very kind of vernacular and used in that settlement, but at the same time making these kind of very large-scale analyses using 1:500 or 1:1000 scale models that replicated almost like natural phenomena, and those two sets of research then converge to allow him to work as an architect with drawing and with thinking and with writing, using all the other tools at our disposal as a designer. But what I was trying to get at the beginning was that it is the material experimentation that allows the designer to think in a very embodied way, in a very embodied, present way about the design challenges that they are trying to synthesize. Because he has worked with the material, understands what the material can do, and working at various scales, understanding in a very physical way the way that fire spreads across a settlement, because he's actually literally modeled it in his space. I think that it gives him more tools as a designer to think about what the real challenges are and the potential solutions to those challenges. Yeah.
And Greg, what about the process of like intuitive knowledge, which I think in this work becomes really valuable, which is maybe as equally important as perhaps research-based theoretical work. So how much does the kind of intuitive play as part of design and as part of research practice in the work of Unit 17?
Yeah.
And I think experimentation, testing, which you can't do except in the physical.
Yeah. I'm nervous to try and pigeonhole our methodology too much, because there's like the way these questions were set up in the email sort of put them at odds with each other, like that perhaps there was a kind of either or scenario here. And the way that I think would be that we would work ideally is that we are working with physical models. We are working with in the very kind of like analog way. Yet, writing one's thoughts down in a paper where one would kind of process your thinking through a process of writing, or perhaps go into drawing and computer modeling, having had the experience of working with the physical material, I think is a very rich process that is very much part of how we teach and how we think as designers, and how it's part of our methodology. And I think it needs bits of everything, and I do see it, across the board in other units. I often like nudge Nico in a review and say, I see they're borrowing that little experiment from us, I think that it's a question of weighting, maybe, it's like, what do we prioritize? What is our way in? Like other units might start with the question about program, the what question, what is the building? Other units may start with the question of where, it's very like context-based. We start with a how question. We think that there's sort of this rich understanding of the potentials of materials and making allows for a particular kind of thinking, but it doesn't rule out all the other methodologies that feed into like a rich design process. I think that, you cannot, operate solely in the analog realm today, in the physical model making realm. We need to be thinking across platforms and integrating all those tools to create like designers that are relevant in our context.
And then maybe to shift the conversation a little bit to Siwe, who I also know works quite a lot with, she works with fabric and I think sewing tactics, and also finds ways to translate those into drawing, but also looks at how experiences of the body and how clothing on the body as a one-to-one experience might be scaled or adjusted. So maybe, Siwe, just to ask you specifically, how did you find the process of working with your hands or sewing particular garments or performance pieces versus looking at how to then translate that into perhaps digital space, into drawings, into maybe more analytical languages? What was possible in each different kind of realm of working?
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting what Greg was saying. This whole thing of making, and craft and using your hands and having this embodied knowledge, I think is really, a compelling idea. And making things does reveal an understanding of this sort of ontological revelation. By doing it, you realize it. But then it's informed by what you're referring to here as instinctive knowledge. I think it's tacit knowledge. There's not over time one has that one might not be able to articulate or verbalize or draw or represent other than through making. That there's this idea of tacit knowledge. I think is really, really important. And your tacit knowledge, is it's like a kind of DNA. It derives from your personal experience, You know, when we're kids, we've all at some point picked up and eaten dirt. You know, we know what dirt tastes like. We know what metal tastes like, that it's cold or that it's hot. So they're not things you talk about, but it constitutes a form of knowledge that's critical to the sensibility of designers.
Definitely. I often say, like, you know, as a designer, if you haven't held a brick in your hand and understood the weight and size of that brick, it's very difficult to design a wall. You know, like, we just draw 2 lines on a page and there's a wall. But you really need to understand, you know, the sort of density of the material, what it feels like to use it and move it. And then, you know, you'll relate to the bricklayer who's laying that brick. And I really think that design will improve if you understand and have worked with and held and smelt and touched and poked the materials that you're designing with.
You know, I worked with an architect many years ago in London. He had worked with SOM, Skidmore, Owings Merrill, in Chicago in the 60s. And each week, you know, if you were a young architect, you know, you were sort of given a task to do, you know, so you would do the stairs on the building in Minnesota, or, you know, the next week you would do the guttering detail of the building somewhere else. But on Monday morning, the head of the studio would bring in an object, and they would be asked to sort of, you know, to describe what the object was. So my friend talked about this thing of, they would sometimes bring bearings in, you know, stainless steel bearings. And they were asked to estimate what the gauge of the bearing was. You know, so through feeling and touching these things regularly, their understanding of the things they were drawing was manifested through sensory experience, and that was then translated into a kind of knowledge. I think it's a really important aspect or dimension of architectural production. I mean, I know that you're a Richard Sennett fan, and this idea of craft is related to this, but it's also, you know, it's about sensory experience and a material and tactile understanding of the world. I think can be a critical dimension of practice.
Siwe, are you back on the line?
I'm back. I don't know if you guys can hear me. No?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
Oh. Sorry about that. So I was saying that I think for me, my process always starts with making a model. I think it's a way for me to make the work not only accessible to the other people, but also to me. It's a way for me to start immersing myself into whatever theme I say I'm dealing with, because intuitively, I always know how to start, but I can't put it on paper. So I always start with a model because I feel you create like tangible aspects to your work. You create a body, a physical piece, which, like the body, comes with restraints and limitations. And I feel sometimes as a designer, you need those restraints to kind of guide your work. Yeah, I hope I've answered.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thanks so much, Siwe. Maybe also to ask Nothando, I think specifically just in response to what Siwe's just mentioned, through your Loom project, which I know was one of your earliest projects that you went on to actually apply into a kind of site organization system. So how the kind of constraints and rules and structure of that fabric loom, which you produced, you found maybe useful or informative to understanding of sites or the archive or layering of a experience of a museum. I'm not sure if you want to respond to that specific point of your project.
Oh, okay. If you hear cars, I'm outside, guys. I'm sorry, and birds chirping. I'm just sitting outside.
No worries.
I think by making that model alone gave so many informants in terms of like how and what was designed, and I think making at a smaller scale to then later inform how what decisions you take at a bigger scale is quite important, because in some instances I would then like work from memory, like remembering how I actually created the smaller loom and how the layers were physical models really assisted a lot. Besides like other facts that I had to like apply in terms of like how you design, where people walk and all of that. But then I think just from making, you are able to pick up on things that you wouldn't have on computer alone.
And am I right in remembering that you used to be in Unit 17 last year?
Yes, you are right. Hi, Natanda.
Yes, sir.
We missed you. Natanda. Missed you
We
this
saw
year.
her. So maybe just in response to that point, you know, how did you find your grounding from Unit 17 useful for your M2 year? You know, maybe it kind of taught you specific tactics in how to explore, a research in a particular way. It would be interesting to hear about the kind of legacy of Unit 17 into another unit.
Being in Units 18 and 17, it wasn't more about like how perfect the model is. It was about the not through making. So for me, that was the biggest point that I got from Unit 17. It's like through on and then how do you then take that further? So I think that's the knowledge that that was a hybrid from Unit 17 to 18 for me.
I want to just jump in here because we often use Notando's projects as a kind of touchstone or as an example precedent for students from last year, because I think the strength of Notando's work was that she was taking ideas about her context, where she lives. You know, she was looking at the mine dumps, thinking about these like huge piles of sand that we have on our horizon and that we're very aware of every day, and really like questioning their presence in her landscape, questioning the toxicity of them and what it was doing to her environment, and then like using those ideas and to develop a whole like thesis about like a kind of like a broader architectural proposition, which was to like convert these things into housing, and really being very innovative with materials, you know, as to how that might get done. She was spraying sand and experimenting with ways of hardening sand using chemicals that she was able to source, you know, through, I don't know how you found them, but it was like Enos and things. You were reading the labels on your ingredients on your household ingredients at home. But it was just a very like kind of emblematic project for us, because it managed to weave together kind of broader social issues with this idea of material experimentation and the like sort of new tectonic proposition. So I felt it was a very, very strong project, and we were sorry that we lost Notando to you guys this year. I would have liked to have seen her what she did as a master's student, but that the nature of the GSA and its strength really is that there's this diversity amongst the units, and that students are able to move between units from year to year and take skills that they might have developed in one unit and apply them in another unit. So yeah, it's very good.
Perhaps Edward, we haven't heard from you yet. So
let's hear from you, Edward.
Hi. Yeah, so for me it was kind of like this jump and return between different scales. I've always been interested in like fabric, exploring it and looking at how it can be manipulated. Hi, Edward.
Hi, Edward. We'll come to you in a moment.
Yeah, I'll finish up quickly. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so it's this kind of like
scale jumping.
Yeah, so it's kind of like this shift scale from the way that we respond to fabric, the way we wear it, looking at it in internal spaces and externally, and kind of like looking at this change in the properties and how when you change scale from as 1:200 or 1:50, the properties of the different materials change. And sometimes you kind of have to look at it intuitively, in the sense that if you drape fabric in a certain direction, the human body will respond automatically. And then going back into the physical models and looking at how you can start experimenting with those different characteristics and how they change in different kinds of contexts, whether we're talking physical or non-physical context. Like, yeah.
I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had between Siwe and Nobu, it seems.
Yeah, sounds like there's some resonance there.
You know, in a sense, Nobu's project is almost the inverse of Siwe's project. Siwe is taking architecture and putting it on her body, and Nobu's taking clothing which is normally on the body and scaled to the body, and applying it to making spatial, like real, like, you know, large spatial propositions. So it would be interesting to hear them talk a little bit about that, I think, to each other.
I think with my project, I don't know, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think with my project, it was about using fabrics and using materials to create the feeling that I was saying architecture creates on Black women in spaces. So I was using that to kind of depict the feeling. So if I spoke about entering a room as a Black woman and the discomfort that comes with it, I wanted the piece, the wearable piece, to have that feeling as you wear it. So I don't know if that helps in terms of how I was looking at fabric and the body.
Yeah, and I think it was about, I think from my understanding, also power in terms of placements, extension, tightness, constriction, freedom of movement, which I think you've just spoken through, which has been really interesting, and definitely there are special experiences. But yeah, I think there probably definitely are resonances with what Nabujele has also just spoken through too. Although I think from my understanding, her work is quite tectonic in how it tries to literally apply that into a scaled up, really fascinating sort of shelter space, which I think we'll show a little bit of that at the end of the talk. Cool. I think Edward, I think you had something to say. You wanted to add to the conversation.
Oh yes, definitely. I did want to add to the conversation. I'd just like to say it was really an amazing journey this year, in terms of, you know, exploring different techniques of working, and this idea of working from home also was like really played a big role in that, where you had to sort of gain or get information from every single person around you, kind of thing, and it was you had to feed certain people to add to your own project, and I think that made sort of gave the project a lot of traction also, and a lot of different nuggets. But in terms of concentrating onto like the same concept of shifting in and out, I think that stayed in being the biggest thing about the project. Looking at urban design, shifting scales in urban design, looking at a fiber, shifting into micro level, and shifting out all the way to, you know, understanding global warming, and that the fact that it's a global issue, but you solve it in a local sort of scale. And that was, yeah, that's what I have to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. I think one last kind of point I'd like to open up for discussion is around the idea of performance, and how performance might be material or tectonic. I know from at least the unit 18 students which have joined this conversation. Perhaps Gloria, we can start with you if your connection will manage it. But just maybe talking through how material, and for instance, in one of the first pieces that you made for Strange Fruit, where you were talking through smells and textures and wrapping as a kind of performative, I think, knowledge system and research system to talk through ideas of home and away. Would you maybe like to expand on that a little bit for us? which maybe diverges a bit from the other kind of drawing work which you did. Gloria, can you hear us? Okay, it might be a connection issue.
In the meantime, maybe we want to talk a bit about what Mark's raised here on the chat bar.
Oh, I see.
He's asking, he says he's interested in the progression from M1 to M2 and the way it's structured and conceptualized. Are there different learning outcomes and opportunities presented by the progression? It is a vertical studio, but it's often not structured in this way. And yeah, I mean, our unit, the honors year is very much seen as a kind of like dry run for the master's year. They're running through the same set of like they're using the same methodology, and we expect the same sort of the same deliverables from both cohorts. But I think that next year, having done this for a few years now, I think that next year, I think we are going to try and treat the honors year as slightly differently to the master's year. I haven't quite worked out how, but I think there is some value in allowing a kind of much looser structure in honors year and then taking it into sort of much more defined deliverables for the master's students. Still working through that in my own head. But Sarah, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think from Unit 18 side, and I think Kuda and Nadia are also on the call if they want to add to this. I mean, I think we'll also be shaping it a little bit differently for 2021. But our approach has really been in M1 to get our students to be as experimental and yeah, I think adventurous in terms of building their set of exploration languages. So that might be in drawing, it might be in sewing, it might be performance, and likely a range of these different approaches to build a kind of design proposition from that. And I think that has been differentiated from the second year or M2, where our students are quite early on asked to produce a kind of argument. So there's a strong conceptual or theoretical idea behind the work, from which they can start to apply the kind of ways of working, which we actually did for everybody, both M1s and M2. We did a kind of a very accelerated sort of M1 experience in the beginning of the year, which was about kind of leveraging new design languages around film, around working with tapestry and model making, etc. So I think that helped everyone kind of get to the kind of points in the second term where I think design languages then could be applied into the kind of broader interests that the students may have found, either from previous year or from the experience in the first term. So yeah, I think we do treat the 2 years quite differently, and there's kind of different pressures for different things. But yeah, I think making is a constant making and trying to communicate in ways that are really interesting and push the discipline, both in terms of what we understand as drawing, and also how we might push the architectural tool set in different ways is really important for us, I guess, throughout the year and for both years.
Sarah, just if you could just touch quickly on the performance aspect, because I am very interested in this. It's like, are you saying that architects, through our training and the way that we see things, have like a unique point of view that can be expressed as performance? In other words, like, what I sometimes wonder is students are making, for example, they entering into different or trying out different modes of representation, like say video or something, and what they'll do is they'll just produce kind of like a B-grade video. If you took somebody who was studying video editing, they would be producing like really high quality videos, and yet the architects or architecture students are continuously looking for new modes of expression, new modes of representation. And I often wonder, is it for the sake of it, or is there like a real point to it? Like, do architects have something very unique to say through that medium with our, given our, knowledge base and our view of the world? And I mean, I'm not saying that they don't, definitely not. I think they probably do, but I just want to hear from you and what the rationale is behind getting architects to perform as a means of expression.
Huda, do you want to respond? See, your video is on.
I'm sorry, I've been behind the scenes. And really nice hearing all of the students talk about your work. I think, Greg, I think that the position of performance in architecture has a very long history, so I think we shouldn't forget that. And of course, I always talk about history because I think sometimes the way we're taught architecture, especially in South Africa, reduces it to a kind of modernist building. But if you think about the Bauhaus, for example, and I think it's an interesting model because it's both about a way of working with materials and experimenting, but also ways of working with performance and the tangible things, and that was a central part of that kind of open curriculum. So I think that for me, the interest in performance is as a way of, I think there's a long history in architecture and a history as doing it in very different ways to other people. I would say the same thing with film. So I was reading recently, returning to some things about Siegfried Krasauer, who's an architect who becomes a filmmaker. And if you think about those like 1920s films that are about the city, where the city is a character, I think there's really interesting stuff, canonical stuff that talks about this relationship. And maybe so I guess that's one part of the sort of thinking that I think is important to remember. But I think in terms of what it means, for me, thinking about space, thinking about architecture is thinking about buildings and materials, but also how we inhabit and use space. And performance and film, and in different ways, can become ways of exploring that. So ways of understanding or rethinking how we inhabit a space, depending on who we are, or what we are, or the historical context, or like lifting up these histories. So in someone like both Siwe and Ntando's work, performance becomes a way of unearthing these histories that live in the materials, but also exist beyond the materials. And I think if you think about what architecture could be, then in many ways performance becomes the way to question that inhabitation, use, and history. And film too. I think film could be, the way we ask students to use film this year, for example, it's actually a kind of really in-depth site exploration. So, but it becomes a way of seeing differently. So yeah, I think that's the ideal. But yes, I think it can. I completely understand. Sometimes it can land quite flat. So that's
wonderful answer. Thanks, Huda. I was really playing devil's advocate there because, of course, it does have value. It was nice to hear it from you and just get your perspective on it. Thank you. And of course, the medium itself is becoming so kind of aggregated. Everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody's a performer these days online. They have their own channels, YouTube channels. And so it's becoming much more democratized, and of course architects have something to say about this, something of value to contribute, and that's very reflective and self-referential, about our profession and about the way that we make spaces and interpret spaces. But thank you, that was wonderful.
Yeah, but I think that I understand your question. That's also a question about other kinds of explorative methods, like what is at stake by using them, and where does it go, and sometimes it doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's also there's a kind of fine line between figuring out when is it valuable and when is it valuable even if it doesn't go anywhere, or when does it actually become a kind of meaningful way of working, thinking.
Yeah, we, in our studio as well, there's a a lot of like a very steep learning curve for students to build competency in doing what they don't ordinarily do. You know, they're not trained in undergraduate. They're picking up brand new skills and experimenting, and you know it's very difficult, the steep learning curve. So and the quality of the work is often I guess just, you know, that of a someone who's new to someone who's coming to these approaches in a very like new way, and there's a kind of freshness and an advantage to that definitely as well, you know, but certainly very challenging. Sorry all, but I need to go. It's been wonderful being with all of you. And thanks for hosting this, Sarah. And it's a great initiative. I think we need to do it more. So possibly next year we can carry on with this kind of thing.
Thanks so much, Greg. Thanks so much for joining us. I had wanted Gloria to join, but we're just having issues with connection. She is on speaker. I'll just give her one last chance. If that doesn't work, we'll just close it there. Hi, Gloria. Can you still hear us?
I can hear you. I don't know if it can be heard, but then again, I can't if it can be heard.
Everyone can hear you.
Okay, sure. That's speaking that. I think your question on performance and material. I think what performance allowed me to do, at least, or how performance allowed me to engage with material, is that it allowed me to embody the experiences within, or the experiences that the varied materials that I used, or it allowed me to use the various materials that I called upon through memory, and invoke a sense of presence in them, and I suppose performance in this sense allows people to ignore the complexities within the complexities of the individual materials, which may potentially be ignored when looking at things on a larger scale. Yeah.
And maybe talking to like smell and texture and your wrapping processes that you looked at, as well as maybe film, how did that produce maybe some unexpected, I guess, discoveries or aspects of your work or research through actually using familiar, sometimes nostalgic ingredients, if I can put it that way, in your work? And maybe also you can also maybe talk to where you sourced all your ingredients from, because I think that was also quite a process of finding your various materials that you used, even for your filming process, which you did quite recently.
I found them quite a large number of them were purchased at the Yovo market, and I think what that process unraveled was what my project ended up becoming about how so much goes into a specific dish or experience that speaks to not only the intimacy of the ritual within the home place that it might occur in, but
so I think just as a closing, we're going to play just a couple extended shots of all the students that have participated in today, except for Edward. I hadn't known that you were joining, but you'll see some examples from both Unit 17 and Unit 18. Just as a last closing, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has joined this conversation. It will be made available on the SummerShow website and the GSA website. Thank you to Huda, Nadira, Greg, who's left us already, Siwe, Nabujele, Notando, Gloria, Edward, and Tebogo.
entera para darte toda la noche que cogía mañanera. Muévete al ritmo del bam, bili bam, bam, bili bam, bili bili bam, 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 bam. Mira esa falta ya por donde anda ese culo. Quiere que le dé su tanda de seguro. En la disco hay mucho escándalo. Pues nos vamos para el oscuro, pues nos vamos en banda y como quiera. Vamos a hacerlo a mi manera y como quiera. Yo le estoy cansando entera, bandolera. Te quiero entera para darte toda la noche que cogía mañanera. Muévete al ritmo del bam, bili bam, bam, bili bam, bili bili bam, 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 bili bam.